point I'm not talking loud enough, like the microphone's not quite close enough, just give me a little one of these, and I'll make sure I move it nice and close so everybody can hear me. Alrighty. Well, like I said, thank you all for being here this morning. As you may know, our theme this year is Women and the Orphan Train. So throughout the day, we're going to explore that topic. We're going to look at different ways that women were involved with the orphan train movement. So I'm going to kick us off this morning by talking about a female-led organization involved that took part in the orphan train movement. And this is the American Female Guardian Society. You're also going to hear me refer to it by a couple other names: the New York Female Moral Reform Society, the Female Moral Reform Society, the AFGS. They're all the same thing. So it can be a little confusing, but it's all the same organization. And this group of women, this organization was born out of the moral reform movements, and it grew to a nationwide coalition committed to reforming society by caring for children. So we'll talk about how they started, their publications, how they distributed their information, their schools and homes for children, and of course, how they were involved with the orphan train. Okay, new clicker. All right, so the 1830s were a time of immense change. There was increased trade across the United States and with other countries. We got more banks, more exchange that way. There was new gas, lighting, aqueducts, new universities, newspapers were being founded, and it was a time of religious revival as well. New churches and tract or temperance or benevolent societies were springing up across the country. And one of these new tracts, or new publications, was McDowell's Journal. Now this was written by Reverend John McDowell. He was a minister who was doing missionary work across New York City. And specifically, he was very concerned with the moral state of New York, and he was viciously attacking immorality. And his journal was actually so outspoken on this topic, and is so bold, that he was actually put on trial by the Presbyterian Church, which he was a part of, for obscenity in his publication by just talking about what was happening in New York. However, his journal was very popular with new reform societies, and they agreed with him and supported him. And one of these was the American Society for Promoting the Observance of the Seventh Commandment. Quite the title. They were a men's organization, and they partnered up with McDowell and continued to increase his readership and distribute his journal as their own publications. And in 1834, a group of women who had been reading these publications, this journal, they gathered together to discuss how women could join in this crusade for moral reform and what they could do to help. So they started out with prayer meetings, and they decided to organize their own society. So in May of 1834, under the direction of that Seventh Commandment Society, they organized the New York Female Moral Reform Society. And in their early days, they remained very closely associated with the Seventh Commandment Society and with Reverend McDowell. And their goals, starting out, were many, and I'll list just a few of them here. They wanted to save their fallen sisters, to add words of warning, to deter the unmarried from entering the way that leads down to death, and prevent evil which was so difficult to cure. They wanted to expose public immorality, elicit public sentiment, and devise and carry into effect the means of preventing licentiousness and vice. And in the end, their overall goal and method was remedy if practicable, and prevention by every possible Christian endeavor. And in these goals, they wanted to serve 4 distinct classes: friendless and deserving young women, destitute children between the ages of 3 and 14, mothers and orphan infants, and dependent mothers with children who should not be separated. So this was their focus. And they organized themselves very quickly and very efficiently. So they had a board of managers that served as their highest level of authority. And this group of women made decisions for the society as a whole. Within this group, they of course had a smaller committee, an executive committee that could get the final say on decisions. And they also had representatives from their auxiliaries across the nation sitting on this board of managers. And like I said, all of the people on this board were women, which I think is pretty astounding considering this was 1834. And I don't know that there were many organizations that were completely led by women at this time. And that board continued to be entirely female-led, female-run for the rest of their history. And as the society grew and started to expand their reach, they decided to organize a board of counselors or an advisory committee. And this was the only governing body that actually had any men as a part of it, and it was all men. And this body served as kind of an extra measure of credibility for the organization, and it enabled them in the early years to purchase property, which they wouldn't have been able to do with just a group of women. And these men also lent professional advice to the ladies. Many of them were lawyers, doctors, pretty influential people, businessmen, those sorts of folks. The society also had a number of committees made up that represented their various programs and services, and these changed frequently because their programs expanded and changed over their 100+ years that they were in operation. And then the society also had a number of employees that worked as missionaries, teachers, collecting agents, matrons, and editors for their paper. And then, of course, we have their general membership, which was organized into auxiliaries across the entire United States. So what were they doing? What were they doing with all of these ladies? Well, at its heart, the AFGS was a missionary organization. So their goal of reform was accomplished through moral instruction as dictated by the Bible. So many of their early missionaries were volunteer members who also served in other capacities in the organization and also had lives outside of their volunteering. And they also employed, like I said, some full-time missionaries. And at first, these were men, usually students from nearby seminaries. But after a few years, they started employing female missionaries and found that they were even more successful than the men and were able to get into more homes and share their message with more people. So then they kind of shifted to female missionaries from then on. And these women were sent to the worst parts of the city where other reformers feared to tread. And they described these areas themselves as too offensive to be touched, considered beyond all redemption, and because it was thought they could not be approached without contamination or jeopardy of life, they were neglected. And it was these areas that they felt their greatest work could be accomplished. And these missionaries also fulfilled many other duties beyond just spreading the word of God, but they also distributed charity items like food, blankets, and later they, of course, started taking in children from these poor areas and finding them help in various ways, one of those ways being finding them homes across the United States. And soon after they began their missionary work, the society started a prison ministry. And they held weekly prayer meetings for women and started small libraries in prisons of mostly religious books, but they had libraries they started. And they began this work in the House of Detention, which was also known as the Tombs, and this was New York's largest city prison. And soon they extended their work to Blackwell's Island and other kind of notorious prisons in the New York area. And these prison ministries also recognized the need for basic prison reform. And in 1840, the society actually sent a committee of women to the mayor and the Common Council of New York on behalf of female convicts, asking for female matrons to replace the men who currently, or at that time, presided over the women in prison. And indeed, in 1845, matrons were appointed to all city prisons and hospitals, including the Tombs and Blackwell's Island, where they had started this ministry about a decade before. The society also opened a home for women seeking reform or refuge in November of 1834. So in their first year, they have accomplished a lot of missionary work, prison work, and then opening this house of reception. And they imagined this home as a place for women who wanted to change their ways. So they could come, they could live in this place, receive support as they changed their lives. And specifically, they were focused on helping women who had become prostitutes and helping them get out of that situation and find other employment. But this goal was not quite as successful as they originally had hoped. And in 1835, just a year later, they kind of shifted their focus away from helping the already fallen to preventing women from becoming fallen. So to this end, they transformed their home into an employment office. And over the years, this employment office was known by many different names: the Registry, House of Reception, Office of Direction. And you can see Office of Direction here and a little bit about what they did. And the society wrote, the Office of Registry was practically an employment office, registering and inquiring in the character of families which applied for domestic helpers, and sending suitable girls or women to them. It was the beginning of a work which the society continued for 60 years or more, and out of it grew problems which were met by opening other branches of the work. And the ladies of the society saw this office as really a stepping stone for the ignorant and friendless out of destruction. And like their quote described, they pretty much, if you needed a job, you could go there and sign yourself up to be considered for employment. And if you needed somebody to work for you, you could go there and be paired up with somebody who needed a job. And this worked pretty well. And like I said, they focused on serving teenage girls and women as their main population. The society also in the early days did a couple other smaller projects. Around 1839, they added a Bethel department focused on helping sailors and their families. So like many of their other groups, they held prayer meetings, distributed tracts, and this work eventually led to the formation of a separate organization called the Mariners Family Industrial Association, which was founded by one of the original members of the American Female Guardian Society. In addition to their work with sailors and their petitions for prison matrons, the AFGS was also involved in a few other legal cases. Between 1840 and 1846, they prosecuted various purveyors of vice and petitioned for laws against prostitution and seduction. And in 1848, a law was passed that recognized abduction and seduction as crimes against society to be punished by the judges. So before that point, it wasn't something that needed to go to court. It was something that was supposed to be worked out between the individual parties involved. And they also spoke out against abortion, and some of their members even testified against the infamous Madame Restell, who was charged with manslaughter after selling abortion-inducing pills. And that is a fascinating trial, so go home and read up on that. It's very interesting. And in their early years, it seems that the ladies of the American Female Guardian Society mostly left the work of caring for children to other organizations. And then as their mission shifted from one of reform to one of prevention, that's when they start to see helping children as part of their work. So it's hard to tell exactly when they started finding homes for needy children, but it seems to have been around 1843, 1844. And in these early years, children were often taken in temporarily by a member of the society, and they would live in their home with them for a short amount of time, or they would be boarded with friends of the society until more permanent homes could be found for these children. And they also worked closely with other organizations in New York City, sending children to the New York Juvenile Asylum, later the Children's Aid Society, and other organizations. And in 1844, they reported that they had found homes for 54 children. And at least in the beginning, these homes were usually in or near New York City. All right. As I previously mentioned, the New York Female Moral Reform Society was organized in large part thanks to the work of Reverend McDowell and his work publishing McDowell's Journal. And in their first year, 1834, the AFGS made a deal with Reverend McDowell, who had a rough year that year. He was in pretty poor health. And they decided to transfer his publication and membership to the newly formed Reform Society. And they renamed that paper the Advocate of Moral Reform. And thanks to McDowell, who had already had an incredibly successful journal, their publication was immediately received by anybody who had subscribed to his paper, and this gave them an instant, already very committed readership across the state of New York and even further than that, New England and the eastern part of the United States. And so the Advocate, which would later go by the Advocate of Moral Reform and Family Guardian, then just the Advocate and Family Guardian, it was published from 1834 when they took it over, all the way until 1941. So over 100 years they're publishing this paper. And by 1838, they were already printing 19,000 copies twice a month. And they doubled that number by 1860. And much of their audience, much of their readers were women with children, and that was their focus. And the Advocate was designed to be, they said, the ally and defender of virtue, and to hold up before the world as their prominent aim, remedy if practicable, and prevention by every possible Christian endeavor. And this paper was also a way for them to raise money to move their ministries forward. And they stated their purposes further as this: to exalt the law of God and prevent its violation, to guard the domestic heart from the invasion of the spoiler, preventing the fall of the innocent, and to produce a reform in public sentiment. And they kind of go on about, reforming public sentiment. But that is really their goal, is to help individuals change their hearts towards what they considered righteousness and away from sin, and then through changing individuals, to change society as a whole. And to these ends, the Advocate included stories of fallen women as a warning, and stories of virtuous women as examples. And they also included lots of poetry. Most of these stories and poems were written by women. The readers of the paper could send things in, and these poems would talk about various virtues and vices. And they also shared stories about foundling and needy children who they kind of held up as the innocent victims of the evils they sought to destroy. And in this paper, the Society also reported on their work, reported their successes in city slums, reported the state of prisons in their communities, and shared accounts of arrests of wicked men and women. And later, they also published letters from foster parents and foster children. And I think this is super interesting. By 1861, the Advocate was not only edited by women, which it was from the beginning, edited by women, but by 1861, the paper was entirely produced by women. So this is the typesetting, the printing, the distributing, the collecting payment, everything for this paper by 1861 was done by women. And the Advocate is interesting because in some ways it's very feminist, which you would, that term wouldn't have been applied at the time, but looking back at it now and seeing that it was all, produced by women, and they were sharing these stories about, exposing wicked men that were taking advantage of women, it seems like it should be very feminist, and in some ways it was. I mean, this is a decade before the Seneca Falls Convention and the beginning of kind of what we now think of as first wave feminism. And they were calling out double standards and calling attention to the dangers that were faced by women of the 19th century. But in other ways, they were very not feminist, and not the way we think of it today, at least, not very progressive. They upheld incredibly high standards for femininity and womanhood. And they did take a stance in the Civil War, but did not take a stance in the issue of women's suffrage. So, kind of an interesting publication there. And we are lucky enough in our collection at the museum to have almost every edition of the Advocate and Family Guardian. So, if you're ever interested in reading those, let me know. Alright, so for the first decade of the Society's work, children were, like I said, not their focus. And instead, they were helping teenagers and adult women. But they did occasionally take in some children, and like I said, it's a little hard to tell how many or exactly when they started this. They were temporarily housed in members' homes or boarded until proper arrangements could be made. And it seems like most of the children placed in their early period, this would be late 1830s, early 1840s, most of those children were probably a little older and were placed in homes as domestic servants. And if society members came across children that they didn't think they could help, maybe they were too young or just a little bit too unruly for them to deal with at this moment, then they took them to the House of Refuge, or like I said, the New York Juvenile Asylum. But as the American Female Guardian Society expanded their reach, they began to see helping children as, like I said, part of their efforts to prevent sin and vice. And they wrote, "In the last 5 years, the problems in regard to destitute children have pressed more and more upon the society. When taken from the jail or hospital where their mothers were imprisoned or dying, or brought by officers, the ladies had to provide temporarily for them, either in their own homes or with women who boarded them. Meanwhile, through the paper or by personal appeals, they described the children and eventually placed them in homes in the city or the country, where they thought they would be loved and cared for, the majority of them being adopted. The numbers of these children increased so that when the project of the new home was thought of, it was soon seen that it should be a refuge for children as well as adults." They considered children a key part of their efforts to prevent vice, stating, "If we can save the children, we shall not have so many suffering and sinning adults to provide for." That was the thought which grew and strengthened. And so the Society's House of Industry and Home for the Friendless, which I'm just going to call Home for the Friendless or the Home, they opened in 1847 in a rented home after a year of fundraising. And during that first year, they were able to help 334 adults and 270 children. And they don't go into particulars about how they helped them, but this would include finding them work, sending them to friends who could take better care of them, reconnecting them with family, or placing children in homes where they could be fostered and eventually adopted. And by 1848, a year later, they were ready to build their own building, which would suit their needs a little bit better, and they did so on land just on the edge of the city with a plot full of trees, and the final building cost them a little over $18,000, which, I mean, doesn't translate exactly today because the cost of building materials and things has increased, but $18,000 today would be about $640,000. So they moved into this new home, which is the building in the center here on the screen. They moved into this building in 1849. And the children that came to this home came from various situations. Some of them came at the request of New York state courts, and then after a few months were returned to their parents. Others lived there temporarily until suitable foster homes could be found, and a few lived at the home for extended periods of time. And the Society at this point also had a very close relationship with the newly formed, as of 1875, a little bit later here, they had a close relationship with the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. So the SPCC, as they were called, would often send children to the Home for the Friendless for care and placement. And they also accepted young women and young mothers with children at this home. And most of these women were between 14 and 20 years old, and they would stay an average of about 2 weeks until they could find work or be sent to other friends or family who could take care of them. And in 1884, the Society reported that their home had received, throughout its history, 30,000 people and had found homes for about 6,000 children. So they are accomplishing an immense work here. By 1879, the society was looking to expand past their single home, which by that time was no longer on the edge of the city and was right in the heart of New York. And that year, in 1879, the director of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children actually donated his personal property and home in Oceanport, New Jersey, to the society to be used as a summer home for the children. So the AFGS graciously accepted this donation, renamed the property the Wright Memorial Summer Home after the director, Mr. Wright, and began using it right away. At first, they reserved this home for sickly children who needed fresh air and kind of to get out of New York City. But gradually, they started using Oceanport more and more and began sending all of the children from the home to the Friendless there each summer. And in 1882, they started the first of many, many additions to this property by adding a chapel. Then, about a decade later, they added a cottage specifically for older boys. And even with this additional housing, they had so many children in their New York home for the Friendless that they had to visit Oceanport in two groups. So they would have an early summer group and a late summer group. So all the children could visit while they were on break from school. Later in the 1890s, they added a hospital, and then in the 1900s, they constructed more housing, more cottages, and they even purchased tents for some of the older boys to camp in, which they loved. And by the late 1920s, the Society's Home for the Friendless was their main work, their main enterprise. They kind of shifted away from those prison ministries, those missionary efforts, and they were mostly, by the 1920s, focused on caring for children. And so by that point, they were able to add more land onto this property, add tennis courts, basketball courts, more playgrounds. And by the time this Oceanport home closed, it had really become a small village, and children lived there year-round. By 1900, the Society was outgrowing their original Home for the Friendless in New York and the Wright Memorial Home in Oceanport. And so they began fundraising for their next home. And this home, as you can see up there in the left corner, was quite large, and it was actually designed by William Tuthill. And he was an architect, and he sat on their board of counselors, and coincidentally, he had just finished designing Carnegie Hall. And he was known for his ability to make very large buildings very functional and also very beautiful. And he certainly did so with the new Home for the Friendless, which was completed in 1902. And this home allowed them to about double the size of their home population, which they definitely needed. And this was known as the Woody Crest Home. And this would see the society through pretty much to the end of their main part of their active ministry. The space was occupied by about 200 children each year, included libraries, indoor and outdoor play spaces, nurseries, offices, and more. And of those 200 children who passed through their doors each year, many were placed out in more permanent foster homes, and some lived in the home for longer periods of time. And as the home family grew, the society also added the Bennett branch home in Liberty, New York. It was pretty far away, and so pretty expensive to get too many children there. So they only sent the poorest and most delicate children there over the summers. But after a few years, it was just too expensive to keep using, and they sold it off and kind of redirected their efforts towards those New York homes and the Oceanport home. And it is also worth mentioning that some of the auxiliaries of the American Female Guardian Society founded their own homes for the friendless. So we talk a lot about the one in New York City because it's the one we know the most about, and we have the records from that home in our collection, so it's easy for us to study that New York home. But the 1857 annual report also mentions two other homes for the friendless just in the state of New York. One of those was in Syracuse, and the other one isn't listed of where it was. But then other auxiliaries outside of New York also opened their own homes for the friendless associated with the American Female Guardian Society. Alright, so now we're going to get to the orphan train stuff, because I know that's what we've all been waiting for. I've mentioned briefly that the American Female Guardian Society did place children in foster homes. And it seems they had started this, like I said, by at least 1844. They wrote, "The idea of transferring children rendered homeless by the death, misfortunes, or wrongdoing of their parents was very easily entertained. A little babe cast upon the pity of strangers was taken to a home in the western part of the state by Mrs. R.P. Penfield, afterwards, for many years, children's secretary. Its warm welcome awakened the desire and belief that many little ones found among the poor and erring classes might be similarly provided for, and it was early made a distinct aim of the society. Christian homes only were asked for, where the children could receive religious nurture as well as temporal care and training. And the board had a medium of correspondence, that would be the Advocate and Guardian paper, which gave them access to many thousand families in different sections of the country through whom such homes might be found for large numbers of children and adults. And based on their annual reports, just the ones that we have in our collection, we can be sure that they started placing children in homes by 1844. The 1846 annual report states that they provided 45 children with homes during that year, but this doesn't differentiate between local arrangements and country placements. But it seems that prior to the construction of their home, they were finding homes for about 50 children each year, and then after their home was built and their focus became more and more on children, they started placing between 100 and 200 children in homes each year. And by 1934, they reported having placed a total of 6,452 children in foster homes. And there's also mention of them occasionally sending children or mothers with children west or even overseas to reunite with family and friends. So kind of similar to the Children's Aid Society's family immigration program. So how did they find good homes for these kids? That's always an important question to ask of each organization we look at in the orphan train movement. And it seems that they had a couple different methods for doing this. First, if you wanted to adopt a child, you could stop by the home for the Friendless and apply for a child in person. Or you could submit an application by mail and then come in person to pick up your child. Or you could have the child brought to your home. And children in these situations would usually travel with someone from the AFGS, and it does seem that they were traveling far enough away to necessitate train travel as early as 1853, a year before the Children's Aid Society began their orphan train movement. Third, the AFGS occasionally organized groups of children to take west in a manner more similar to what we would think of like the Children's Aid Society, where they would be chosen by a family after reaching their destination. And the earliest record of this kind of larger group placement so far I found is 1855. And occasionally the AFGS would also partner with other organizations, sending a few children at a time to societies like the Children's Aid Society to join their larger groups. And we see this as early as 1854. They were sending children to be added to Children's Aid Society groups going out on orphan trains. But regardless of how foster children came to be in their new foster homes, the AFGS did encourage formal indenture agreements and later adoption. And wording for these agreements existed as early as 1848. So children would live with their foster families for a few months on a trial basis, and if everything went well, they would then send some indenture paperwork out. And these indenture agreements were not quite the same as legal adoption, which would go through the state, but this was just an agreement between the society and the family stating the needs of the children and the requirements that the society outlined. So these stipulated that the family would provide food, drink, clothing, washing, lodging, mending, education, religious training, and all other needs for the child until the age of 18 or 21. And they also agreed to write to the society at least once a year, and must include a portion of writing from the child themselves. And the child was expected to be honest, orderly, and obedient. And at the end of the indenture, the family was supposed to give the child an agreed upon sum of money to kind of help them on their way into adulthood. And we know from the annual reports of this society that the children who were placed near New York City were also expected to visit the home in person every so often to kind of make a report on how they were doing. And children who were placed further away, ladies from the society would visit them after they were placed, and then they could remove them from those homes if they were unsuitable. So they reported, "A phase of our work that has ever been of special interest is that of the personal visitation of homes where our children are placed, either before or after they are permanently located. They go to foster parents or guardians always on trial and remain on conditions prearranged and deemed mutually satisfactory. It is of vital importance that these conditions be met. If domestic changes occur, so conflicting with the welfare of the child as to require removal, the transfer must be made through the stated visitor or otherwise. An average of more than 5,000 miles per annum are traveled in summer's heat and winter's cold in visiting, locating, and transferring the home children for whose welfare the managers feel measurably responsible." So that, like other organizations, there was a system for checking up on these kids. We also know that they received letters from children and their foster families, and many of these were reported in their annual reports, and they also had books full of these letters that they would copy down so that they had a record of each child. So they said, "The children placed in homes abroad are never forgotten at the home. The record of each has been faithfully kept from the first, so that we possess a brief but complete history of each child from its introduction into the home until its majority is attained." And these history books that they refer to here make up a large portion of our American Female Guardian Society collection, and we are lucky enough to have, I believe, 12 volumes of these history books that outline, like they said, exactly what happens to each child from the moment they step foot at the home for the Friendless to the moment they turn 18 or 21, depending on the year. And they are a great source of information, not just for children who were placed out on orphan trains, but for also just for children who were placed in local arrangements in New York City. And from these records, we can tell that there were a couple specific women involved in these foster home placements, and those would be Mrs. Penfield, Mrs. Ambler, and Mrs. Evans. And you will hear more about Mrs. Penfield and Ambler later this afternoon with Lori's presentation. So like the Children's Aid Society, the AFGS was also focused on helping children who didn't need homes but just needed an education. In 1849, they began lobbying the state of New York for mandatory schooling for all children, and a law to that effect was passed in 1853. And they also recognized the need for schools where all children would be welcome. Public schools in the 1800s had pretty strict rules for attendance, behavior, and dress. And these rules prohibited many children from attending school at all because they had to work partial or full days, maybe they couldn't fit a full day of school into their schedule, and many of them just didn't have the appropriate clothing to wear to school. And these children would be kicked out or prevented from attending these public schools, and then they would have no way of gaining an education. So industrial schools, like the AFGS founded, and then very soon after the Children's Aid Society founded, these industrial schools had no attendance mandates and they had very loose dress codes. So this allowed many, many more children to attend. So the AFGS opened their first industrial school in 1854, and by 1884, 30 years later, they were operating 12 schools across New York City. And they had about 5,000 children registered as attending on their records for that year. And their schools reserved mornings for moral and mental instruction, then they provided a very simple lunch, and then used the afternoons for teaching and practicing sewing and other practical skills. And students at their schools created hundreds of garments each year, which then were distributed back to the children and their families. They also rewarded obedient children with tickets that they could use to purchase more clothing and shoes. And children who did particularly well at these industrial schools were encouraged to transfer to public schools if their situations allowed that. And teachers at these schools were not just school teachers. They were also missionaries, and they made house calls to students' homes to see how the society could assist them in other ways, whether that was providing food every so often, or extra clothes or blankets, or making sure that the children stayed healthy and getting them, to doctors and those sorts of things. All right. So we briefly talked about this, but the AFGS very quickly became a nationwide organization. And they had members and auxiliaries across the country. And in their third year, they actually reported 226 auxiliaries and 15,000 members. And that number only grew and grew and grew. And we have some of their membership books in our collection, and it's fun to kind of look through and see the ones from, California and Colorado, and I don't think I found any Kansas ones yet, but I know there's some in there. So it's fun to see how national this organization was. So the AFGS and their programs were primarily funded, as I mentioned briefly, through the sales of their newspaper, The Advocate and Family Guardian. And they also, of course, relied on donations from their national membership. And they also did receive some public funding after about 1856, but really that funding was pretty nominal. And some of their notable donors included some quite interesting people. So we had Abraham Schermerhorn, who was a wealthy merchant, but I think he's better known for being the father of the Mrs. Astor. There was also Chauncey Rose, who was a very successful businessman and real estate investor. And he was also a major railroad founder, and he was responsible for distributing actually his brother's estate, which he primarily gave to public charities. And so between his brother's money and his own money, he gave over $2 million to charities, mostly in New York, and including the American Female Guardian Society. We also have Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt, and she is listed on this acknowledgments page here in the middle, and that was kind of fun to find her on that list there. She, of course, was the wife of the Vanderbilt steamship and railroad magnate family, and her family also was kind of a rival of the Gould family, and they were also major donors to the American Female Guardian Society, which I'll get to in a second here, but I almost wonder if they tried to donate each other, which I think would be kind of fun. There were many early abolitionists that were part of this group or donated, lots of ministers. We also, the man whose collection founded the New York Public Library often donated to the American Female Guardian Society. We also had Amos B. Eaton, who was a cousin of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He was a Civil War general. He also donated often to the society. And then most interesting, a little local connection here, George B. Cheever was a minister. He was a classmate of many interesting authors like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Longfellow. He wrote lots of books himself. And his sister was Mrs. Ichabod Washburn, whose husband founded Washburn University in Topeka, Kansas. So we do have some connections here across the country. Horace Greeley also often donated to this society. He donated to the building fund, and he was super involved, and he, of course, is known for being a newspaper editor, publisher, founder of the New York Tribune. He ran for Congress, for in a presidential race, and he was very involved with lots of reform movements. So it's really no surprise that Horace Greeley was interested in this as well. We also have The Hutchinson family singers are listed as donating to the society, and they were entertainers in the 1840s who sang in four-part harmonies. They kind of sang political satire songs, and they were a family of 11 sons and 2 daughters. So they're quite interesting as well. And then, like I said, we have the Gould family pops it up here. Helen M. Gould, she was the daughter of J. Gould, and she inherited a large portion of his fortune, which she donated mostly to charities. She was particularly involved in the society and in other public and social welfare groups. She herself adopted 3 children, though probably not through this organization. But she did a ton for the AFGS. She was on their board in 1894 and continued for many years. She gave them lots of money, took the children on trips to parks, invited children to stay in her home for short amounts of time, and then sponsored many of their holiday parties. And they actually wrote in one of their reports that for several years the expense of the sewing, cooking, basketry, and carpentry classes in all of the schools was met by Helen Gould. And she also funded special teachers and added over $20,000 to their building fund in 1902 when they were building Woody Crest. So they have quite the interesting involvement from pretty famous people here. And it's always fun to see, who was funding these reform movements. The Children's Aid Society had the Roosevelts were very involved, and the AFGS had the Goulds very involved. You kind of get these different families popping up with their favorite charities. So how did it roll to an end? The AFGS and the Home for the Friendless continued their work with children throughout the 20th century, and in 1965, that's when they changed their name and were no longer the American Female Guardian Society, were no longer the Home for the Friendless. And they became Woody Crest Youth Services. And then in 1972, they merged with Happy Valley School, which was actually a branch of the 5 Points House of Industry. And they shifted their operations then to upstate New York. In 1977, they merged again with another charity and became Greer Woody Crest Children's Services. And by the 1990s, they had fallen on some hard times. They merged with another charity in an attempt to save their facilities in upstate New York, but by 1996, they had gone out of business. And after leaving their beautiful home on Woody Crest Avenue, that building was sold, and today it houses the Highbridge Woody Crest Center, which is dedicated to families and persons dealing with AIDS. So you can still see their building, it's still there, it's beautiful. And just kind of in summary, to end here, as I've studied the American Female Guardian Society, I am just amazed at this fascinating and honestly very unique example of female-led charity work in the 1800s. I hope that more and more people can be made aware of the incredible reach and influence of this society, and that more researchers will choose to look into its connections to women's rights and feminism. I mean, there are really not many papers or books out there about this society, which is surprising because we know it extended across the entire country. So I hope there's more to come out about this society soon. We are lucky enough to have many of the original orphanage records from the Home for the Friendless in our collection. And we also, like I mentioned, have copies of almost every edition of The Advocate at our museum. So I'm eager to see what more we can learn from these records and discover the full extent of the Home for the Friendless's orphan train program. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to do that later this morning. So thank you all for listening.